I was 17 years old when I watched my parents' coffins being lowered into the ground, and the man standing beside me, pretending to cry, was already planning how to steal everything they left behind. My uncle didn't waste a single day before he showed his true colors, and what happened next turned into a battle that would change my life forever. This is the story of how my own blood tried to make me homeless, take over my father's company, and destroy everything my parents built. But I fought back in a way he never saw coming. If you've ever felt betrayed by someone you trusted, you need to hear what happened next, because this gets absolutely insane. The accident happened on a Tuesday night in October, and I still remember every detail like it was yesterday. My parents were driving home from a business dinner when a drunk driver ran a red light and hit them head on, and they didn't survive the impact. I was at home studying for my exams when the police knocked on our door, and in that moment, my entire world shattered into a million pieces. I had always been close to my parents, especially my dad, who built his company from nothing and promised me I'd take over one day. Now that future seemed impossible, and I felt completely lost and alone in the world. My Uncle Richard showed up at the hospital before I even got there, and he was my father's younger brother. Growing up, I thought he was the coolest person in the world because he always brought me expensive gifts and told me wild stories about his adventures. But looking back now, I realized those gifts were always bought with money he borrowed from my dad and never paid back. My father had bailed him out of debt at least 5 times that I knew about, and probably more times that I didn't. Richard had tried multiple businesses over the years, but they all failed because he spent more time partying than actually working. The funeral was on a Saturday, and over 300 people showed up to pay their respects. My father was well loved in the community because he treated his employees fairly and donated to local charities every year. I stood there in my black suit that suddenly felt too tight, shaking hands with strangers who told me how sorry they were for my loss. My Uncle Richard stood right next to me the entire time, his hand on my shoulder like he was supporting me, but I could feel something was off. He kept whispering in my ear about how everything would be okay and that he would take care of me now. At the time, I thought he was being kind, but those words would come back to haunt me in the worst possible way. The day after the funeral, Richard showed up at our family home with a lawyer I had never seen before. He sat me down at the dining table where I had eaten breakfast with my parents just 2 weeks earlier and told me we needed to discuss my future. His lawyer pulled out a stack of documents and started talking about estate management, company ownership, and legal guardianship. I was confused because my parents had a family lawyer named Mr. Thompson who had worked with them for over 15 years. When I asked why Mr. Thompson wasn't there, Richard waved his hand dismissively and said this was a specialist who understood these complicated matters better. Richard explained that my father's company was in serious financial trouble and needed immediate intervention to survive. He claimed there were debts I didn't know about, contracts that were falling apart, and employees who were already looking for new jobs. According to him, the company would collapse within 3 months unless someone experienced took control right away. He looked me straight in the eye and said that as much as he loved me, I was just a teenager with no business experience whatsoever. The logical solution, he explained, was for him to take over as CEO and chairman of the board until I turned 25. He made it sound like he was doing me a massive favor and saving my inheritance from complete destruction. Then came the part about our family home, the beautiful house where I had lived my entire life. Richard told me that the house was actually mortgaged heavily and the bank would foreclose unless we sold it immediately. He suggested I move in with him and his wife temporarily, just until things stabilized and I finished high school. His lawyer pushed a pen toward me and pointed to several signature lines on the documents spread across the table. I felt dizzy and overwhelmed, drowning in legal terms I didn't understand, while my uncle kept saying we needed to act fast. Something deep in my gut told me this was wrong, but I was grieving and exhausted, and part of me just wanted someone else to handle everything. That night, I couldn't sleep because something Richard said kept bothering me. My father had always been careful with money, and proud of the fact that our house was paid off completely 5 years ago. I remembered him celebrating that milestone with champagne and telling me this house would always be mine, no matter what happened. And next morning, I did something that probably saved my entire future. I called Mr. Thompson, our actual family lawyer, and asked him to meet me at a coffee shop away from the house. When I told him what Richard had proposed, his face went pale and then turned red with anger. Mr. Thompson pulled out his own laptop right there in the coffee shop and started showing me the truth. My father's company was not in financial trouble at all. In fact, it was more profitable than ever, with over $8 million in liquid assets and contracts secured for the next 3 years. The house had no mortgage and was titled in a trust that made me the sole owner upon my parents' death. My father had a detailed will that appointed Mr. Thompson as the executor and set up a management structure for the company until I turned 21. Everything Richard told me was a complete lie, designed to trick me into signing away my inheritance while I was vulnerable and grieving. Mr. Thompson explained that if I had signed those documents, I would have legally transferred ownership of both the company and the house to Richard. The papers Richard's lawyer brought weren't about temporary management or protection of assets. They were actual transfer of ownership documents that would have made Richard the permanent owner of everything my parents built. I felt sick to my stomach, realizing how close I had come to losing everything because I trusted family. Mr. Thompson assured me that we would fight this, but I needed to be strong because Richard wouldn't give up easily. He warned me that things were about to get very ugly, and he was absolutely right. When I got home that afternoon, Richard was already there, waiting for me with his lawyer again. He asked where I had been, and when I told him I met with Mr. Thompson, his friendly mask finally slipped. His face twisted with rage, and he started yelling that Mr. Thompson was a washed-up old man who didn't understand modern business and was trying to turn me against my own family. I stood my ground and told him I knew the truth about the company and the house. Richard's lawyer quickly packed up his briefcase and left, but Richard stayed, and things got scary fast. He got right in my face and told me I was making the biggest mistake of my life by refusing his help. Over the next 2 weeks, Richard launched what I can only describe as a campaign of psychological warfare against me. He called me every single day, sometimes 5 or 6 times, leaving voicemails that alternated between fake concern and outright threats. He told me I was too young and stupid to run a company, that I would lose everything within a year, and that I'd end up homeless and begging him for help. He contacted my father as business partners and told them I was mentally unstable from grief and couldn't be trusted with important decisions. He even showed up at my school and tried to convince my principal that I needed to take a leave of absence for my mental health. The stress was crushing me, and I started having panic attacks and nightmares about losing my home. Then Richard escalated even further in a way I never expected. He filed legal documents claiming that he was entitled to 50% of my father's company based on an alleged verbal partnership agreement from 20 years ago. His new lawyers argued that my father and Richard had started the company together, even though every record showed my father started it alone, and Richard had never been involved. They produced fake emails and forged documents that supposedly proved Richard had invested money and deserved ownership. Mr. Thompson told me this was a common tactic where unethical people try to overwhelm grieving families with legal battles, hoping they settle just to make it stop. But I refused to settle because I knew my father would want me to fight for what was rightfully mine. The court hearing started 2 months after my parents' death, and walking into that courtroom was terrifying. Richard sat across the aisle with 3 expensive lawyers, while I had Mr. Thompson and 1 associate. Richard's team presented their fabricated evidence and painted a picture of my father as someone who cheated his own brother out of a fair partnership. They claimed Richard had been promised ownership for years, and my father kept delaying the paperwork. Their star witness was one of Richard's old drinking buddies who lied under oath and said he heard my father promise Richard half the company. I watched the judge's face carefully, trying to read whether he believed any of this nonsense, but he remained completely neutral and professional throughout. When it was our turn to present evidence, Mr. Thompson systematically destroyed every single one of Richard's claims. We had bank records showing that Richard never invested a penny in the company and actually owed my father over $200,000 in personal loans that were never repaid. We had email chains where my father explicitly told Richard he would not be given any ownership because of his unreliability and financial irresponsibility. We had testimony from the company's chief financial officer who confirmed that Richard had been banned from company premises 5 years ago after he showed up drunk and harassed employees. Most damning of all, we had evidence that the documents Richard submitted were created recently and backdated, which is fraud and forgery. A trial lasted 3 weeks, and during that time, Richard tried one last desperate move. He hired a private investigator to dig up dirt on me, hoping to prove I was an unfit owner. The investigator followed me around, talked to my friends, and tried to bribe my teachers into saying negative things about me. When that didn't work, Richard started spreading rumors in the community that I was on drugs and partying with my parents' money. He posted anonymous messages on social media, claiming I was destroying my father's legacy and running the company into the ground. It was all lies, but some people believed it, and I lost friends who thought I had changed. The loneliness was almost worse than the legal battle because I felt like Richard was stealing my reputation along with everything else. But here's where things finally turned around in the most satisfying way possible. Mr. Thompson's associate had been quietly investigating Richard's financial history, and what they discovered was explosive. Richard had been running a scam for the past 7 years where he convinced elderly people to invest in fake business opportunities and then stole their money. He had defrauded at least 15 people out of their retirement savings, totaling over $1 million. The associate had contacted the FBI weeks earlier, and federal agents had been building a case against Richard while our civil trial was happening. Everything was about to come crashing down on him in spectacular fashion. During the final day of testimony, 2 FBI agents walked into the courtroom and arrested Richard right there in front of the judge, both legal teams and about 30 spectators in the gallery. The lead agent announced that Richard was being charged with wire fraud, identity theft, and racketeering across multiple states. Richard's face went from confusion to panic to complete terror in about 5 seconds. He tried to run toward the exit, but the agents grabbed him and handcuffed him right there. His expensive lawyers immediately distanced themselves, packing up their materials and leaving the courtroom like the building was on fire. The judge looked shocked, but called for order and continued the proceedings without Richard present. With Richard in FBI custody, his entire lawsuit collapsed immediately. The judge reviewed all the evidence we presented and ruled that Richard had no legitimate claim to any portion of my father's company or estate. The judge went further and issued a restraining order preventing Richard from contacting me or coming within 500 feet of me or the company headquarters. He also referred Richard's lawyers to the State Bar Association for potential ethics violations related to the forged documents. I sat there trying to process what was happening, barely able to believe that this nightmare was finally ending. Mr. Thompson squeezed my shoulder and whispered that justice had prevailed, and I felt tears streaming down my face from pure relief. The local news covered Richard's arrest extensively because some of his fraud victims were prominent community members. The newspapers ran stories about how he had betrayed his own nephew while secretly running a criminal enterprise. People who had believed his lies about me reached out to apologize, and my real friends told me they never doubted me for a second. The company's employees sent me a huge flower arrangement with a card thanking me for fighting to preserve what my father built. For the first time since my parents died, I felt like maybe everything would actually be okay. I was exhausted and traumatized, but I had won against someone who tried to take everything from me when I was most vulnerable. Richard's criminal trial happened 8 months later, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. Federal prosecutors presented bank records, emails, recorded phone calls, and testimony from multiple victims who lost their life savings. Richard tried to play the sympathy card, claiming he had a gambling addiction and needed treatment rather than prison. The prosecutor pointed out that Richard had spent the stolen money on luxury cars, expensive vacations, and high-end watches, not in casinos. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before finding him guilty on all 23 counts. The judge sentenced him to 15 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole for at least 10 years. But the absolute best part, the moment that still makes me smile when I think about it, happened during Richard's sentencing hearing. The judge allowed several of his victims to give impact statements describing how his fraud destroyed their lives and retirement plans. One elderly woman explained that she lost her entire nest egg and now had to work as a grocery store cashier at age 72. A retired teacher said Richard's scam forced him to sell his house and move in with his daughter. After hearing these heartbreaking stories, the judge looked directly at Richard and said something I'll never forget. He stated that Richard S.'s attempt to defraud his own orphaned nephew while under the guise of helping him was one of the most morally reprehensible acts he had seen in 30 years on the bench, and that Richard deserved every single day of his prison sentence. The courtroom erupted in applause when the judge finished, which almost never happens during sentencing. Richard was led away in handcuffs, and as he passed by where I was sitting, he looked at me with pure hatred. I looked him right in the eyes and didn't say a word, but I wanted him to see that he hadn't broken me. Mr. Thompson said later that Richard would probably serve his full sentence because he had made so many enemies in prison by bragging about his wealth on the outside. Federal inmates don't take kindly to people who steal from the elderly, and Richard's reputation preceded him. He would have a very difficult 15 years, and honestly, I felt zero sympathy for him after everything he put me through. Today, 3 years after my parents' death, I'm 20 years old and actively involved in running my father's company. I am not the CEO yet because I am still learning, and we have an experienced manager in that role. But I attend every board meeting, and major decision requires my approval. The company has grown by 30% since I took ownership, and we've expanded into 2 new markets. I hired additional staff, increased employee benefits, and started a scholarship fund in my parents' names. Everything my father built is thriving, and I know he would be proud of how I fought to protect his legacy. The house where I grew up is still my home, and I've kept everything exactly how my parents decorated it, because it brings me comfort. Mr. Thompson remained my lawyer, and eventually became like a grandfather figure to me. He guided me through finishing high school, applying to colleges, and learning the business world. He never charged me a single penny beyond his normal fees, and he spent countless hours teaching me about contracts, negotiations, and how to spot people trying to take advantage. When I tried to give him a bonus for saving my inheritance, he refused and said seeing me succeed was payment enough. Last year, I established an annual award at the State Bar Association in his name, recognizing lawyers who go above and beyond for young clients. He cried when I surprised him with the announcement, and so did I. As for my Uncle Richard, I haven't spoken to him since the sentencing hearing, and I never will. His wife divorced him 6 months into his prison sentence and moved to another state with their kids. None of his old friends visit him or put money in his commissary account. He sends me letters sometimes, usually around my birthday or holidays, trying to apologize and asking for forgiveness. I don't read them anymore. I just return them unopened because he lost the right to communicate with me when he tried to make me homeless. Some people think I should forgive him for my own peace of mind, but I disagree. I've made peace with what happened by succeeding and building a good life, not by excusing his cruelty and greed. Looking back on everything that happened, I learned lessons that most people don't learn until they're much older. I learned that family doesn't always mean loyalty, and blood relationships don't guarantee someone has your best interests at heart. I learned to trust my instincts when something feels wrong, even if I can't explain exactly why. I learned that there are good people in the world, like Mr. Thompson, who will fight for you when you're down. Most importantly, I learned that resilience isn't about being fearless. It's about being terrified, but fighting anyway, because the alternative is losing everything that matters. If you're going through something similar, or if someone is trying to take advantage of you during a difficult time, please don't stay silent. Reach out to professionals you can trust, document everything, and don't let fear or grief prevent you from protecting yourself. Predators like my uncle specifically target people who are vulnerable because they think we're easy victims. Prove them wrong. Fight back with every ounce of strength you have, and don't stop fighting until justice is served. You deserve to keep what's yours, and you're stronger than you think you are, even when everything feels impossible. Thank you for sticking with me through this entire story. I know it was long and intense, but I wanted to share every detail because someone out there might be facing a similar situation right now. If this story helped you in any way, or if you have your own experience with family betrayal, please leave a comment below because I read every single one. Don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed it and subscribe to the channel for more real-life stories about overcoming impossible odds. I'll see you in the next one. And remember, never let anyone steal your future, no matter who they are or how much they pretend to care about you.